April 17th, 1943, RAF Bassingbourn, England. Technical Sergeant Michael Donovan hunched over the damaged fuel transfer valve of a B-17F Flying Fortress as dawn broke over the fog-shrouded airfield. In less than 3 hours, 21 bombers would take off for the Focke-Wulf plant in Bremen, and the flight crews were confident that the recent modifications to their aircraft would bring them home safely. They couldn't have been more mistaken. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how one man's unauthorized modification to the B-17's fuel system would save hundreds of airmen's lives and change the strategic bombing campaign over Europe, even as it pitted him against the very military bureaucracy he had sworn to serve. The 91st Bombardment Group had arrived in England just 5 months earlier, in November 1942, part of the 8th Air Force's expanding presence. Their mission was straightforward, but nearly impossible: daylight precision bombing of Nazi Germany's industrial centers. Leading this group was Colonel Stanley Ray, a West Point graduate with an impeccable record and unwavering faith in military protocol. We follow specifications to the letter. Colonel Ray reminded his maintenance crews during their first briefing at Bassingbourn. These aircraft were designed by the finest engineers in America. Any unauthorized modifications compromise safety and mission effectiveness and will result in immediate court-martial. Captain Eleanor Sanderson, the depot supply officer responsible for maintaining the parts inventory for the group's 24 B-17s, dutifully recorded every specification in her logbooks. A former engineering student at MIT before the war, she had volunteered for the Women's Army Corps and found herself tracking thousands of spare parts for the most complex aircraft in the theater. Each B-17 has 550 feet of fuel lines and 12 separate fuel tanks containing 780 gallons of aviation fuel, she explained to newly arrived ground crews. The factory specifications for every component have been tested extensively. Our job is to maintain them precisely as designed. Among those listening was Technical Sergeant Michael Donovan, a 32-year-old former Packard automotive engineer from Detroit who had enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor. Donovan had spent his civilian career modifying high-performance engines and had an intuitive understanding of fuel systems that went beyond technical manuals. "With respect, Ma'am," Donovan said after the briefing, "I've noticed something concerning about the cross-feed valves. When they're exposed to extreme cold at altitude, they—" "Sergeant," Captain Sanderson interrupted, "the Wright R-1820 engines and all associated fuel systems were extensively cold weather tested in Alaska before deployment. Your concerns have been addressed by the manufacturer." Donovan nodded respectfully, but remained unconvinced. He had already seen 3 B-17s return from missions with unexplained fuel transfer problems. The bombers were flying at altitudes approaching 30,000 feet, with outside air temperatures reaching -60 degrees Fahrenheit, conditions far more extreme than any Alaskan testing had replicated. The B-17F was an impressive machine by any standard. Each bomber carried 800 pounds of bombs and was defended by 13 50-caliber machine guns. The aircraft's 4 Wright Cyclone engines produced 4 800 horsepower, allowing it to cruise at 170 miles per hour with a maximum range of 2,000 miles. Boeing had delivered 3 405 B-17s of all variants by 1943, with production reaching 16 aircraft per day. What concerned Donovan wasn't the impressive specifications. It was a seemingly minor component, the fuel selector valve. This critical part allowed pilots to switch between fuel tanks, balancing the aircraft during flight and ensuring all fuel could be accessed. The standard issue selector valve contained a rubber seal that, according to Boeing's specifications, would function reliably at all operational temperatures. Lieutenant James Harkins, pilot of the B-17F Detroit Demon, first noticed problems during a mission to Wilhelmshaven in February 1943. We were at 28 feet when the number 3 engine began to lose power, Harkins reported during debriefing. Temperature gauge showed normal, but the fuel pressure was dropping. Switching to the alternate tank had no effect. We feathered the prop and continued on 3 engines. Similar reports began accumulating. By April 1943, the 91st Bombardment Group had lost 7 B-17s to unexplained fuel starvation issues. The official maintenance investigation concluded that crews were improperly operating the fuel selector valves, and additional training was ordered. Sergeant Walter Klein, the flight engineer aboard Carolina Princess, disagreed vehemently with this assessment. "I've been flying since before these investigators were out of diapers," Klein told Donovan during a late-night maintenance session. "These valves are freezing up at altitude. The rubber compound gets brittle, then cracks. Once that happens, you're flying a 30-ton glider with a bomb load." The statistics were becoming alarming. 8th Air Force records indicated that 12% of bomber losses in early 1943 were attributed to mechanical failures rather than enemy action. Of these, 37% involved unexplained fuel system malfunctions. With each B-17 carrying a crew of 10 men, these non-combat losses were devastating. Donovan spent his off-duty hours examining damaged fuel selector valves from returned aircraft. In his small workshop behind Hangar 4, he disassembled the components and subjected them to extreme cold using dry ice acquired from the medical corps. The results confirmed his suspicions. At temperatures below -40 degrees, the standard rubber seal became brittle and developed microfractures. On March 12, 1943, a particularly devastating mission to Rouen saw 3 B-17s from the 91st Group crash into the English Channel due to fuel system failures. 27 airmen were lost. That night, Donovan made his decision. Using materials scavenged from around the base, Donovan created a modified selector valve using a synthetic rubber compound he had developed based on his pre-war work with racing fuel systems. This material, a mixture of neoprene and silicone components borrowed from various medical supplies, remained flexible even at the extreme temperatures encountered at high altitude. "What exactly are you doing, Sergeant?" Captain Sanderson asked. Finding Donovan working late in his makeshift workshop, Donovan straightened up, wiping grease from his hands. "Just studying the factory parts, ma'am. Trying to understand why they're failing." Captain Sanderson examined the disassembled valves on Donovan's workbench. With her engineering background, she immediately recognized that these were not simply being studied, they were being modified. "This is a court-martial offense, Sergeant," she said quietly. "Unauthorized modifications to aircraft components." "And how many more crews are we going to lose before Wright Aeronautical acknowledges the problem?" Donovan asked. "These boys are dying because of a 10-cent rubber seal that can't handle the cold." Captain Sanderson picked up one of the modified valves, examining the altered seal material. "What is this compound?" "Something I developed for high-performance engines before the war. It stays flexible down to -70 degrees. I've tested it." She placed the valve back on the workbench. "I never saw this," she said after a long pause, "and I certainly didn't see you installing it on any aircraft under my supervision." The next morning, Donovan arrived before dawn and installed his modified valve on a single aircraft, the Memphis Belle, scheduled for the Bremen mission. The installation took 45 minutes, and he carefully disposed of the original component where it wouldn't be found. Captain Robert Morgan, the pilot of Memphis Belle, returned from the Bremen raid with a harrowing report. "We took heavy flak damage over the target," Morgan told intelligence officers during debriefing. "Lost pressurization and had to descend to 16 usual feet. Outside temperature was -42 degrees. Number 2 and 3 engines both showed fuel pressure fluctuations, but when we switched to auxiliary tanks, the transfer was smooth. Frankly, I was surprised it worked. Those valves have been problematic for months. For Donovan, this was the confirmation he needed. Over the next 2 weeks, working night shifts when supervision was minimal, he modified the fuel selector valves on 17 B-17s assigned to the 91st Bombardment Group. He kept meticulous records of his modifications, noting the tail number of each aircraft and the date of installation. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Sullivan, the group's maintenance officer, began noticing a statistical anomaly by late April. Aircraft from the 91st were reporting significantly fewer fuel system malfunctions than other groups in the 8th Air Force. "We've gone from leading the statistics in fuel system failures to having none in the past 14 days, Sullivan remarked during a staff meeting. "Either we've suddenly got the best maintenance crews in England, or something's changed that I don't know about." Colonel Ray was pleased but suspicious. "Have Boeing or Wright sent any bulletins about updates to the fuel system components?" "No." "Yes, sir," Captain Sanderson replied, avoiding eye contact with Donovan, who stood at attention near the door. "No official modifications have been authorized." The success of Donovan's modified valves became increasingly difficult to ignore. By early May 1943, word had spread to other bomber groups stationed in England. Sergeant William Barker from the neighbouring 381st Bombardment Group approached Donovan after a supply pickup. "Word is your B-17s aren't dropping out of formation with fuel problems anymore," Barker said casually. "We lost 2 last week. Same old story. Fuel transfer valves freezing at altitude." Donovan hesitated, aware that revealing his unauthorized modifications could end his military career, but the thought of more crews being lost to a preventable mechanical failure outweighed his personal concerns. That night, in the dimly lit confines of a maintenance hangar, Donovan showed Barker how to modify the selector valves using his synthetic rubber compound. He provided a small supply of the material and detailed instructions for installation. "This never came from me," Donovan said, "and for God's sake, make them look factory original when you're done." By June 1943, Donovan's modifications had spread to 4 bomber groups. The statistical improvement was dramatic. Fuel system failures across these units dropped by 87% compared to unmodified groups. An estimated 53 B-17s and their crews had been saved from almost certain loss. Colonel Stanley Ray was not a man who believed in coincidences. When maintenance reports from across the 8th Air Force revealed the disparity in fuel system reliability between his group and others, followed by the mysterious improvement in several other groups, he ordered a thorough investigation. Major William Harrison, an engineering officer from Veight Bomber Command Headquarters, arrived at Bassingbourn on June 12, 1943, with orders to inspect all B-17 maintenance practices. "I want to see every aircraft component that's been replaced in the past 60 days, Harrison announced to the maintenance staff. "And I want to interview every crew chief individually." For 3 days, Major Harrison methodically examined maintenance logs, spare parts requisitions, and aircraft performance reports. On the morning of the 4th day, he requested a private meeting with Colonel Ray. Captain Sanderson and Technical Sergeant Donovan were summoned to attend. The office was uncomfortably silent as Harrison laid out his findings. "Colonel, I've identified unauthorized modifications to the fuel selector valves on 23 of your aircraft," Harrison stated flatly. "The rubber seals have been replaced with an unidentified synthetic compound, not approved by Boeing or the Air Technical Service Command." Colonel Ray's face reddened. "Who authorized these modifications?" Before Harrison could respond, Donovan stepped forward. "No one, sir. I take full responsibility." Do you understand that you violated at least 7 regulations regarding aircraft maintenance?" Harrison asked, "not to mention potentially compromising the safety of these aircraft and their crews?" "With respect, sir," Donovan replied, "the data suggests I've done the opposite. Since installing the modified valves, we haven't lost a single aircraft to fuel system failures. Before that, we were losing one or two every week." Captain Sanderson cleared her throat. "Major Harrison, I've compiled the statistics from all 8 bomber command groups over the past 3 months. She handed him a folder containing neatly organized charts. "The 4 groups using the modified components have experienced an 87% reduction in fuel-related emergency landings and losses." Harrison studied the documents with a deepening frown. "These modifications still violated proper channels. There are procedures for addressing equipment deficiencies." "We filed 7 official deficiency reports," Sanderson countered. "All were dismissed by Wright Aeronautical as operator error or within design parameters." The tension in the room was palpable as Colonel Ray studied the reports. His entire military career had been built on following regulations to the letter, but he was also responsible for the lives of hundreds of young airmen. "How many aircraft outside our group have been modified?" Ray asked. Donovan hesitated before answering. "Approximately 47 aircraft across 3 other groups." "Sir." "Good God, man," Harrison exclaimed. "You've compromised nearly a quarter of the operational B-17s in England." "He may have saved them, Major," Captain Sanderson interjected. "The data is conclusive." Colonel Ray stood and walked to the window overlooking the airfield, where crews were preparing for the next day's mission. His conflict was evident, upholding military discipline versus potentially saving hundreds of lives. "Major Harrison, what does your engineering assessment tell you about Sergeant Donovan's modification?" Ray asked after a long silence. Harrison reluctantly consulted his notes. "The material appears to maintain flexibility at extreme temperatures far better than the standard components. It's actually quite ingenious." He looked up with professional admiration despite his disapproval. "Where did you develop this compound, Sergeant?" "I worked on high-altitude racing engines before the war, sir," Donovan explained. "We encountered similar problems with fuel system elastomers at low temperatures. This is a refined version of a solution I developed in 1939. The meeting concluded with an uncomfortable compromise. Major Harrison would report the unauthorized modifications to 8 Bomber Command, but with a technical recommendation that they be officially evaluated rather than immediately removed. Donovan would face disciplinary action, but Colonel Ray agreed to argue for leniency given the lives potentially saved. What none of them anticipated was General Ira Eaker's reaction to the report. As commander of the 8th Air Force, Eaker had been watching the devastating losses of his bomber forces with growing concern. The daylight precision bombing campaign was under threat, not just from German fighters and flak, but from the harsh realities of high-altitude operations that designers in comfortable American factories hadn't fully anticipated. On June 24, 1943, General Eaker visited Bassingbourn personally. After inspecting one of the modified B-17s and reviewing the performance data, he made an unprecedented decision. "Sergeant Donovan," Eaker addressed the nervous mechanic directly, "your methods were completely unacceptable, but your results are undeniable." Donovan stood at rigid attention, expecting the worst. "I'm establishing a special technical committee effective immediately," Eaker continued. "Its mission will be to identify and implement critical field modifications that can't wait for the normal procurement cycle. You'll serve as technical advisor, working with Wright and Boeing representatives to formalize your fuel system modifications." The implications were enormous. Rather than being court-martialed, Donovan was being asked to institutionalize his innovation across the entire 8th Air Force bomber fleet. By August 1943, the Donovan valve, as it became unofficially known, was being installed on every B-17 arriving in England. Wright Aeronautical, after initial resistance, adopted a version of the synthetic rubber compound for production aircraft. Engineering bulletins were issued to all maintenance units in the European theatre of operations, with step-by-step instructions for retrofitting existing aircraft. The impact on bomber operations was immediate and significant. Veit, Bomber Command statistics for September 1943 showed a 92% reduction in fuel system-related losses compared to January of the same year. An estimated 500 bomber crews, 500 airmen, would ultimately be saved by this single modification. Captain Eleanor Sanderson, whose tacit approval had allowed Donovan to continue his work, received a commendation for her detailed statistical analysis that helped validate the modification's effectiveness. She was promoted to major and transferred to Wright Field in Ohio, where she helped establish improved testing protocols for high-altitude aircraft components. For Technical Sergeant Michael Donovan, the recognition was more complicated. He received the Legion of Merit for his contribution to the war effort, an almost unheard-of honor for a non-commissioned officer. But the citation carefully avoided mentioning that he had violated regulations and proper channels. "You realize you could just as easily have been court-martialed?" Colonel Ray commented as he presented the medal. "Yes, sir," Donovan replied, "but then a lot more boys wouldn't be going home." The broader significance of Donovan's act of insubordination extended beyond the immediate lives saved. It represented a crucial shift in military thinking about field modifications and the value of practical experience over theoretical design. By late 1943, the 8th Air Force had established formal channels for combat crews and maintenance personnel to submit improvement suggestions that would receive expedited evaluation. Lieutenant James Harkins, the pilot who had first reported problems with the fuel system, completed his tour of 25 missions in October 1943, one of the first crews in the 91st Bombardment Group to do so. Of his original crew, all 10 men returned home alive, despite flying some of the most dangerous missions of the air campaign, including Schweinfurt and Regensburg. "We wouldn't have made it without Donovan's valve," Harkins told reporters at a war bond rally in Chicago in early 1944. "On our 20th mission, we lost 2 engines over the target and had to transfer fuel from auxiliary tanks to keep the other 2 running. With the old system, we would have been in the North Sea. Instead, we limped home on 2 engines from 500 miles inside Germany." The story of Michael Donovan's unauthorized innovation spread throughout the Army Air Forces. By 1944, his example had inspired dozens of critical field modifications that improved aircraft performance and survivability. The formal Special Technical Committee that General Eaker had established evaluated over 300 suggested modifications during the remainder of the war, approving 118 for immediate implementation. The most profound impact, however, was on military procurement and testing procedures. The harsh reality of combat operations had exposed flaws in the development process that no amount of stateside testing had revealed. After the war, the newly established U.S. Air Force incorporated combat environment testing as a fundamental requirement for all aircraft systems, a direct result of lessons learned from the fuel valve crisis. Michael Donovan returned to Detroit after the war, where he established an aerospace components company specializing in extreme environment applications. His synthetic rubber compounds eventually found their way into the early American space program, where they performed flawlessly in the vacuum and temperature extremes of orbital flight. In 1957, during a reunion of the 91st Bombardment Group in Memphis, Tennessee, the aging veterans gathered around the preserved Memphis Belle, the first B-17 to receive Donovan's modified fuel valve. Captain Robert Morgan, the aircraft's pilot, raised a toast to the former sergeant. To Michael Donovan, Morgan said, who had the courage to break the rules when the rules were breaking us. Donovan, now a successful businessman with grey at his temples, looked embarrassed by the attention. I just fixed what needed fixing, he replied simply. The fuel selector valve crisis of 1943 remains a compelling example of how rigid adherence to procedure can sometimes cost lives, while creative insubordination, though risky and potentially career-ending, can save them. It underscores a timeless military dilemma. When does following orders take precedence over the immediate welfare of those serving on the front lines? Colonel Stanley Ray, the by-the-book commander who ultimately defended Donovan's actions, perhaps summarized it best in his post-war memoir. Military discipline is essential, but it must serve a purpose beyond itself. When regulations become obstacles to the very mission they are meant to support, and especially when they needlessly endanger lives, the truly disciplined officer must have the moral courage to question them. Sergeant Donovan taught me that sometimes the finest expression of duty is knowing when duty itself requires one to challenge the established order. By 1945, every B-17 and B-24 in the U.S. Army Air Forces had been equipped with cold-resistant fuel system components based on Donovan's design. The modification was so thoroughly integrated into production that many post-war aviation engineers assumed it had always been part of the original specifications. The true story only emerged decades later, when military historians began analyzing the statistical anomalies in bomber loss rates during mid-1943. What they discovered was a brief but significant divergence between bomber groups. A period when some aircraft inexplicably survived, while others with identical factory specifications did not. Behind those statistics lay the story of an automotive engineer from Detroit who couldn't stand by while young men died from a preventable mechanical failure, even if preventing it meant risking everything he had worked for. In 1985, at the dedication of the 8th Air Force Museum in Savannah, Georgia, a small display was added, featuring one of the original modified fuel selector valves and a photograph of Technical Sergeant Michael Donovan. The placard beneath it reads simply, "Sometimes saving lives requires breaking rules." Donovan never spoke publicly about his wartime innovation until shortly before his death in 1997, at age 86. When asked by an interviewer if he had any regrets about his decision to modify the aircraft against regulations, the elderly veteran shook his head. "The only thing I regret," he said quietly, "is that it took us losing 27 boys in the Channel before I found the courage to do what I knew was right from the beginning." His story serves as a powerful reminder that moral courage sometimes means standing alone against established authority, not out of rebellion, but out of a deeper commitment to the very values that authority is meant to uphold. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.